The airport bustled with movement, a restless tide of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the constant hum of conversations. Families shuffled toward security. Business travelers tapped away at laptops. Flight announcements droned overhead. It was the usual chaos. But for Colonel James Thornton, this day was anything but routine. His polished dress shoes clicked against the tile floor as he stepped inside, shoulders squared, uniform crisp. At 58, he had seen his share of battlefields and bureaucratic nightmares, but today's mission carried a weight unlike any other. Private First Class Andrew Mitchell, 26 years old, gone too soon. His remains, draped in the American flag, waited on the tarmac. Thornton had made a promise long ago: no one gets left behind. He adjusted his hat, inhaled deeply, then approached the airline counter. A young woman mid-30s barely looked up as she typed on her keyboard. "Good morning, sir. Destination?" "Phoenix," he said, sliding over his military orders and ID. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier." She hesitated, just for a second. Then, with a tight-lipped smile, she scanned his documents. Her fingers slowed on the keyboard. "One moment, Colonel," she said, her voice suddenly stiff. She glanced toward her co-worker, whispered something, then turned back. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's an issue with your ticket." Thornton's jaw tightened. "What kind of issue?" She didn't meet his eyes. "I'm afraid we can't allow you to board at this time." Silence. Outside, on the tarmac, a casket waited. Inside, the mission had already begun to derail. Colonel James Thornton's grip tightened around the folder containing his orders. He had seen this before: the hesitance, the quick exchange of glances, the careful wording meant to keep him in the dark. But this wasn't a combat zone or a high-stakes negotiation. This was an airport, and all he was asking for was to board a flight to fulfill a solemn duty. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "I need clarification. What exactly is the issue?" The agent swallowed, her fingers tapping against the keyboard as if the answer might magically appear. "It's just, there's a security protocol in place," she said finally, offering a stiff smile. "Unfortunately, we can't override it." Thornton exhaled slowly through his nose. Years of discipline kept his temper in check. "What protocol?" His voice was calm, measured. "I've flown with military escorts before. I know the process. This isn't standard." The woman hesitated again, then turned toward her supervisor, a man in his mid-50s with a receding hairline and a name tag that read Carl Simmons. Simmons walked over, hands folded in front of him, wearing the strained expression of someone who wanted this conversation to be over before it began. "Colonel," Simmons said, nodding curtly, "I apologize for the inconvenience. But we have strict procedures in place, and unfortunately, we can't make exceptions at this time." Thornton squared his shoulders. "This isn't an exception," he corrected. "This is a military transport of a fallen soldier. Every document is in order. You're denying me boarding on what grounds?" Simmons sighed, shifting his weight. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but we have policies." "Policies," Thornton repeated, his voice sharpening. "You keep saying that, but you haven't told me which one applies to me." Behind him, the line of passengers grew. Some were now watching, their conversations fading into murmurs. A few exchanged glances, sensing something wasn't right. Then, from somewhere behind Thornton, a voice cut through the tension. "Do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Thornton turned slightly. A man in his early 70s, broad-shouldered with a weathered face, stood a few spots back. His USMC cap sat low over his brow, and his sharp blue eyes locked onto the supervisor. Simmons cleared his throat. "No, sir. This isn't about clearance." "Then what's it about?" the Marine pressed. "Because I've been through security plenty of times, and I've never seen a protocol stop a soldier from escorting one of our own." More murmurs. A young woman in a denim jacket clutched her purse, frowning. A man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, thumbs moving fast. Someone else muttered, "This doesn't seem right." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. The agent behind the counter looked even more unsure now, fingers frozen over her keyboard. Thornton didn't move, didn't blink. He knew exactly what was happening. Bureaucracy at best. Discrimination at worst. and they were waiting for him to step aside, to sigh and accept it. That wasn't going to happen. "Sir," Simmons said, now glancing toward the growing audience, "please understand, we are just following policy." "And yet," Thornton said coolly, "I still haven't heard a single explanation that makes sense." The Marine took a step forward, folding his arms. "Yeah, and I think the rest of us would like to hear one too." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd. Passengers started pulling out their phones. The air shifted. The airline had made a mistake. And now the world was watching. Colonel James Thornton didn't move. His back was straight, his hands resting lightly on the counter, but his entire body was charged with tension. He had faced standoffs before, on foreign soil, in negotiations where lives were at stake. But this was something else. The agent behind the counter kept her eyes locked on the screen, as if staring at the pixels long enough might make him disappear. Supervisor Carl Simmons stood rigid, clearly uncomfortable with the growing scrutiny. Then, the Marine in the USMC cap stepped forward. "This doesn't sit right with me," he said, voice steady but firm. "And from the looks of it, I ain't the only one." A woman in a red blazer turned to her husband. "He's in uniform, for God's sake. What the hell kind of rule would stop him from getting on that flight?" More passengers were starting to murmur, shifting in line, glancing at the counter with a mix of curiosity and concern. A young woman near the back, no older than 30, raised her phone slightly. "Excuse me, sir," she said hesitantly, looking at Thornton. "I don't mean to intrude, but are they actually refusing to let you board?" Thornton exhaled through his nose. "That's correct." The woman blinked, as if expecting a different answer. She turned her phone screen toward him. "I'm live right now," she said. "People need to see this." A sharp crackle of energy ran through the terminal. The man in the hoodie, who had been typing furiously on his phone, let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "This is blowing up." The Marine grunted approvingly. "Good. Let's see how long they stick to their policies once this hits the right people." At the counter, the agent swallowed hard. The weight of dozens of eyes on her, of the recording phones, of the silent but simmering anger in the air, it was getting to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked at the keyboard again, but the screen held no magic solution. "Sir, please," she said, barely above a whisper. I need to check with my supervisor again." "You go ahead and do that," Thornton said evenly. She bolted toward the back, disappearing through a frosted glass door. Simmons, left standing alone, ran a hand over his temple, his discomfort now plain as day. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a man muttered, "It's already trending." A woman near the windows gasped. "Oh my God," she said, turning her phone so others could see. "It's all over Twitter." A bold headline in capital letters flashed across her screen. "They just denied a U.S. Army colonel his flight while escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. Hashtag let him fly." Underneath, the retweets climbed. Comments poured in. Then another tweet appeared, this one from a veteran advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at airport name. Our soldiers deserve better. Expect action." Simmons' face paled. The growing wave of passengers staring at him, waiting for an answer, felt suffocating. The airline had officially lost control of the situation. And Colonel Thornton? He didn't have to say a word. The world was speaking for him now. The tension in the terminal thickened like a brewing storm. The usual airport chaos, the flight announcements, the distant chatter, the rolling of luggage, had faded into the background. All focus was now on Colonel James Thornton and the scene unfolding at the airline counter. Phones were out, cameras were rolling, and online, the fire had already spread. A young man in a hoodie, still glued to his phone, let out a low whistle. "Jesus," he muttered. "This thing's everywhere now." An older woman in a denim jacket clutched her purse, shaking her head. "This is a disgrace," she murmured to her husband. "A man in uniform, escorting a fallen soldier, and they're treating him like this?" A baby fussed in a stroller nearby, but his mother didn't even notice. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, her face twisting with disgust. And then, like a spark igniting dry grass, the energy in the terminal shifted. "Excuse me." A woman in her 50s, with a sharp voice and an even sharper glare, waved her hand at the counter. "Can someone explain why this man isn't on his flight yet?" The agent who had initially denied Thornton's ticket was still gone, hiding in the back. But Supervisor Carl Simmons was very much present and visibly sweating. "Ma'am," he started, hands raised in a pacifying gesture, "I assure you we are working to resolve." "You're working on nothing," the Marine in the USMC cap cut in. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of authority. "You're stalling, hoping this blows over." "It won't." Simmons swallowed. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. And then, as if fate itself had decided to twist the knife, a young airport security officer, barely in his mid-20s, hurried up to the counter, a phone in his outstretched hand. "You need to see this," he told Simmons, his voice tight. Simmons hesitated, then took the phone. His eyes flicked to the screen, and the blood drained from his face. "What?" the Marine grunted. "Something wrong." Simmons didn't answer, but Thornton already knew. A major news outlet had picked up the story. The headline was brutal in its simplicity. U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline scrambles for answers. Beneath it, a video played, footage from inside the terminal, passengers filming as Thornton stood firm, refusing to be dismissed. The camera panned to the crowd, to the growing frustration, to the undeniable reality that this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an outrage. Simmons handed the phone back, his lips pressing into a thin line. He inhaled sharply, then turned to Thornton. "Colonel," he said, his voice thinner now, forced. "We deeply regret this situation. There was an error in our system. We'd like to issue an apology and personally escort you to the gate. First-class accommodations, of course." First class. As if that was the issue. Thornton's eyes didn't waver. He let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle over the room. "I don't need first class," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "I need respect. And so does the soldier I'm escorting." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd. A middle-aged man in a suit nodded. A young mother whispered, "Damn right." Simmons looked like he wanted to disappear. But it was too late. The airline had officially lost control of the story. The terminal had transformed. This was no longer just an airport delay. It was a battleground for accountability. The usual distractions of travel, the distant drone of announcements, the shuffle of feet, the beeping of boarding passes, had faded into irrelevance. Every set of eyes was locked on Colonel James Thornton and the standoff at the airline counter. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Simmons, the supervisor, tugged at his collar. He was no longer just dealing with an unhappy passenger. He was facing a full-blown PR nightmare. His gaze darted between the colonel, the growing crowd, and the sea of recording phones. Then, as if the situation couldn't escalate further, a deep, commanding voice cut through the air. "Colonel." A figure strode toward the counter with purpose, his polished black shoes clicking against the tile. His presence alone seemed to shift the energy in the room. He wasn't from the airline. He wasn't airport security. He was military. Major Thomas Beckett. The name tag on his navy blue suit read Department of the Army. His ID badge, clipped neatly to his pocket, confirmed it. He moved with the quiet authority of someone who had been sent to clean up a mess. Simmons visibly stiffened. "Sir, we were just about to." Beckett didn't even look at him. He stopped directly in front of Thornton and extended a hand. "Colonel," he said firmly, "I've been briefed. We're handling this now." Thornton shook his hand, his grip strong and steady. He didn't have to ask how Beckett had arrived so quickly. The military doesn't play games when it comes to its own. Beckett turned to Simmons. "The Department of the Army has arranged for alternative transportation. Colonel Thornton and Private First Class Andrew Mitchell will not be flying commercial." Simmons blinked. "Aye, sir, we were just about to." "You were just about to cover your tracks," Beckett interrupted, his tone polite but razor-sharp. "That won't be necessary anymore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances, realizing what had just happened. The U.S. Army had stepped in, The airline had officially lost any remaining control over the situation. A woman near the windows gasped, holding up her phone. "The Pentagon just released a statement," she whispered in disbelief. "They're investigating." Simmons' face went pale. The weight of the moment settled over him like a lead blanket. Beckett glanced at Thornton again, his expression unreadable. "Your transport is waiting, Colonel." Thornton nodded, adjusting his hat. "Understood, Major." Then he turned back to the Marine in the USMC cap, the man who had spoken up first, before the cameras, before the news, before the outrage. "Appreciate you, brother," Thornton said, offering a firm nod. The Marine tipped his head in return. "We look out for our own." Thornton gave the room one last glance. The people who had spoken up. The ones who had refused to stay silent. The ones who had made sure this story was heard. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Not toward the gate. Toward something bigger. The moment Colonel James Thornton stepped away from the counter, the air in the terminal shifted. The energy that had built like a gathering storm didn't dissipate. It rolled outward, rippling through the crowd, through the cameras still recording, through the thousands of phones lighting up across the country. The airline had lost. But the battle wasn't over. Thornton didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had fought too many fights to waste energy on gloating. Instead, he focused ahead, on the mission, on Private First Class Andrew Mitchell, on the family waiting to receive him for the last time. That was all that mattered. But behind him, the consequences for the airline were only beginning. Carl Simmons, the airline supervisor, ran a shaky hand over his face, his eyes darting toward the glass door where the gate agent had disappeared. He looked at the passengers, at their folded arms, their narrowed eyes, their unwavering stares. He knew what they were thinking. He knew this wasn't going away. The young airport security officer stepped forward again, his expression tight. He held up his phone. "Sir, you might want to see this." Simmons didn't want to, but he took the phone anyway. The headline at the top of the screen hit like a sledgehammer. U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldier. Airline faces backlash. Simmons scrolled. The article was already filling up with comments. "I will never fly with this airline again. This is disgusting. Who made this decision? Our soldiers deserve better." And then the final blow. A tweet from a U.S. senator. "Unacceptable. I expect immediate answers. This will not be ignored." Simmons' stomach dropped. The Marine in the USMC cap chuckled dryly. "Yeah, buddy," he muttered, arms crossed. "You screwed up." The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were furious. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in business casual, turned to her husband. "Did you see what the veteran groups are saying? They're already calling for an investigation." A man in a polo shirt checked his phone. "They're saying stocks are already dropping." The younger woman who had started the live stream earlier turned her camera back toward the counter. "The airline still hasn't issued a real apology," she said, voice firm. "So I guess we'll just wait for them to get their story straight." A murmur of agreement rippled through the terminal. Simmons clenched his jaw. The airline's PR team was about to have the worst morning of their lives. Meanwhile, miles away, in an office lined with framed photographs of shaking hands and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, a CEO's phone buzzed relentlessly. Emails flooded in. Calls from board members. Urgent messages from the legal department. Damage control. Too little, too late. By the end of the week, the fallout was undeniable. The airline stock took a 6-point nosedive. A veterans coalition filed a formal complaint. News outlets ran the footage on every major network. Customers flooded the airline's social media with calls for a boycott. And then came the final nail in the coffin, a lawsuit. As for Thornton, he completed his mission. He stood tall as the flag-draped casket was handed off to Private Mitchell's grieving family. He saluted, then quietly stepped back, allowing them their moment. There were no reporters. No cameras. No viral headlines. Just a soldier being brought home. That was the real fight. Not trending hashtags. Not stock prices. Not corporate apologies crafted by PR firms. Respect. It shouldn't take a scandal. It shouldn't be conditional. And thanks to the voices in that airport, thanks to the people who refused to look away. This time, justice was served. But next time, Thornton wasn't so sure. Because injustice doesn't go away on its own. It hides, and it waits for silence. A week later, the story was still making headlines. News anchors dissected every detail, politicians called for hearings, and airline executives scrambled to repair their battered reputation. But for Colonel James Thornton, none of that mattered. He had done what he set out to do. He had brought Private First Class Andrew Mitchell home. Now, standing at Arlington National Cemetery, Thornton adjusted his hat and took a deep breath. The folded flag was gently handed to Mitchell's mother, a woman whose eyes held a grief too deep for words. She clutched it to her chest, her shoulders trembling. I just don't understand why they made it so hard, she whispered, her voice raw. Thornton's jaw tightened. Neither do I, ma'am. The Marine from the airport had made the trip, standing a few feet away, his USMC cap still firmly in place. He let out a heavy sigh. Damn shame it took the whole damn country watching for them to do the right thing, he muttered. Thornton nodded, his expression unreadable. It shouldn't have taken cameras. It shouldn't have taken outrage. He looked out at the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. Respect shouldn't be something you have to fight for. The Marine grunted. You think they learned their lesson? Thornton exhaled. For now. But he knew better. Because silence lets these things happen again. And next time, there might not be cameras rolling. The story of Colonel James Thornton wasn't just about one soldier being denied a flight. It was about something far bigger. How easily respect can be withheld, and how dangerous silence can be. If no one had spoken up, if the Marine hadn't challenged the airline, if the passengers had simply looked away, Thornton would have been forced to step aside. A fallen soldier's final journey would have been delayed, disrespected, forgotten. That's how injustice works. It thrives in hesitation. It survives in policies no one questions. But that day, people chose to see. They chose to speak. And because they did, the truth didn't disappear. The lesson? Silence is complicity. Every day, injustices like this happen, some small, some devastating. And not all of them go viral. Not all of them get the attention they deserve. But when good people refuse to stay silent, change happens. Colonel Thornton didn't want headlines. He didn't need applause. He just wanted respect. And the fact that he had to fight for it, that any soldier would have to fight for it, should make every one of us pay attention. Do you believe respect for our soldiers should never be conditional? What would you have done if you were there that day? Let me know in the comments. If you want more powerful stories that reveal truth and inspire change, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let's make sure no hero ever goes unnoticed.